is Black Friday for land around the world, as I was described. Right? Everyone's trying to buy things like they're on sale. So why did the US not build an empire while Europe did? We were too busy building an industrial empire and growing in the West at the time. And the US is a toddler compared to middle-aged Europe. We have to focus on the basics first. But the focus shifts in the 1890s. The nation faced a slumping economy, businesses craved new markets for American products, and political leaders feared global domination by European empires. So, we have isolationists. Their belief is that Americans should remain detached from foreign conflicts. It was too costly for both money and people to be involve ourselves in other people's wars. And so there's contradictions to U.S. isolationism. You have the Monroe Doctrine going all the way back to President James Monroe in the 1820s, which said that Europeans should stay out of Latin American affairs, and that the United States would call shots for the entire Western Hemisphere. And the corollary to that is that we would stay out of European affairs. So the United States went to war with Mexico, gaining new vast territories in the Southwest. So, empire or not to empire, question still asked today. For American imperialism, the arguments for is to move at the end of our frontier. We had a need for raw materials, a need for new markets, and a desire to become a world power. The arguments against say that it undermined American ideals, that we were once part of a vast empire and we didn't like it, we broke off. It violated the Constitution with some of these interventions. It would hurt the American workers because it would cause an influx of cheap labor. And some people feared an increase in non-white people in American territory. So, going a little further back, when it was the Mexican-American War, the U.S. basically wins battle after battle after battle in the Mexican-American War. And it's all the way down to Mexico City and is occupied. The Mexicans have been utterly defeated. We can basically ask for anything. And we end up getting is, modern day Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, that area. But none of the stuff south of the Rio Grande. That's because a lot of the region that we got was not inhabited by a lot of actual Mexicans. It was a lot of white settlers and Native Americans. And south of the Rio Grande, there's a lot of people that were Hispanic or Latino, and a lot of them were Catholic. And so basically took the areas that had more white Protestants for the Catholic areas that people of color. So it's not a new thing. So if you do less empire, American expansion, Alaska, we acquired it for its vast natural resources. We purchased it from Russia a little bit after the Civil War for $7.2 million. We have Hawaii. Right, the island served as a central way station for American merchants trading with China. American settlers grew, as a cash crop, exporting to Europe and the United States. So how we get Hawaii, a bit more messy. American Marines used threat of military action to force Queen Lily to resign, and the United States would later formally annex the islands. The Philippines served as the base for American power in Asia, and this is what we get from the Spanish-American War. Same in Puerto Rico. It was a key naval base in the Caribbean. It would help the U.S. economy, and we got it from Spain as part of the Spanish-American War. So there we go, Spanish-American War. Spanish-American War of 1898 ended Spain's colonial empire. Spain was really the first one to have this colonial empire, and they've been slowly losing it in the Western Hemisphere, and secured the position in the United States as a Pacific power. The U.S. victory in the war produced a peace treaty that compelled the Spanish to relinquish claims on Cuba and cede sovereignty over Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to the United States. The United States also annexed the independent state of Hawaii during the conflict, and the war enabled the United States to establish its predominance in the Caribbean region and pursue a strategic and economic interest in Asia. So basically, we'll get into this, but Cuba wants its independence. They are fighting against Spain. We find a pretty flimsy pretext to get involved to say we can help Cuba get its independence, which it does nominally do. However, after helping Cuba defeat Spain, we get some of their territories. And those are territories that some of them we still have today. So war cloud group. Cuba had been under Spanish rule since the landing of Columbus in 1492. Columbus was a governor of Cuba very early on, got recalled because he did a good job. Cuba wanted their independence. In 1868, they staged a revolt that was put down. In 1895, a new revolt broke out, and Spain is not happy. It's time to punish these rebels. So, Spain responded with a policy of reconcentration, where they forced movement of a large number of people into detention camps for military or political reasons. So, this should sound at least a little familiar and horrifying, right? Because you're like, we're going to take one group, we're going to force them in camps together. It's going to be a concentration camp. That's what it is, right? And then people are going to die. Around 200,000 Cubans died in these camps. Cuban exile, Jose Marti, appealed to the United States for help. Right? They had just horrifying conditions in these camps. Right? They said in 1868, Cuba, one of the few remaining Spanish colonies in Latin America, rebelled. After 10 years of revolution, the revolution collapsed. Rebel leaders led by Jose Marti fled the United States, began to gather support. So these horrifying images in the camps. All right, so these things are many Americans were sympathetic toward the Cuban cause. The cause drew a parallel to America's struggle for freedom against Great Britain. They are geographically close, and the media is going to dramatize the events. Others who had money invested in Cuba wanted to intervene to protect their interests and investments. American investors were tied to sugar and rice plantations, railroads, and iron mines. So there's a whole spectrum to how you can feel about this. Some people are like, listen, we were once a colony of a European power. We fought back. We won. We should help someone that does this. Right? There are people that see the horrors of what's happening in the camps. So this is morally wrong. This should stop. But others want to see the U.S. empire grow, and then there's the businessmen. So much of this is just businessmen wanting to have better access to these markets and using the U.S. military to force their way in. So, the power of the newspaper. Despite all the negative news coming from Cuba, neither President Cleveland nor McKinley would initially intervene. But then you have newspaper publishers, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. They tried to provoke American citizens to call for war. You finish the pictures, I'll finish the war. Okay, that's fine. William Randolph Hearst. Headlines, they sell newspapers. And more sold newspapers equals revenue. So they do yellow journalism. They have headlines and stories that played up the horror in Cuba. And then finally, when fighting broke out in Havana, Cuba's capital city, President McKinley sent the battleship Maine to protect American lives and property. So, what is yellow journalism? All right, these are all examples of tabloids. Right, but this is a style of reporting and displaying news in a sensational way that distorts the truth. They are more focused on getting you to read and buy it than it being correct. And so when the Cuban cause becomes popular and they start focusing on this, right, it's going to change American public opinion. So the USS Maine is sent into the Havana harbor and it blows up. And at the time, they legitimately do not know what has caused this. But they don't take any time in blaming. So on February 15th, 1898, the USS Maine exploded and sank, taking the lives of 260 men. The Americans blamed Spain, right? And they said, "Remember the Maine." Right? That was the battle cry for revenge. Right? Dispute about who sunk the Maine, and I mean, so now it is a freak accident that anything was caused by Americans being negligent. All right, so everyone's pointing fingers. So the actual battle cry was "Remember the Maine" to hell with Spain. So although President McKinley wanted to make peace with Spain, he finally gave in and asked Congress to declare war on April 11, 1898. Surprisingly, the first battle was not fought in Cuba, but the Philippines, another Spanish colony. All right, so the Philippines are all the way close to Asia and the Pacific. All right. And this is going to go very positively for the United States. So in December of 1898, the United States and Spain signed a peace treaty. The treaty that ended the Spanish-American War was called the Treaty of Paris. There's a ton of treaties of Paris. You will not be able to probably look that up. Cuba gains independence, but not the true independence it sought. The United States paid $20 million to Spain, and in return, we got Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and we got Guam. One of the cabinet secretaries called it a splendid little war. The fighting lasted around 4 months. Less than 400 Americans died from combat, but more than 4,000 died from disease and spoiled food. So it's a two-front war. Right? We have Cuba, it's right next to Florida, and the Philippines, really far away. Cuba was colony of Spain. They were running it essentially as a dictatorship. Right, and so this is why the U.S. is going to get involved. We're going to be fighting both in Spain and the Philippines, Cuba and the Philippines. So the United States replaces Spain as a colonial power in the Caribbean. Cuba was independent in name only. Congress forced Cuban government to adopt the Platt Amendment in its constitution. This is named after Orville Platt. And this amendment limited Cuba's power and made it U.S. protectorate. So protectorate is an independent country whose policies are controlled by an outside power. And the U.S. is going to intervene in Cuban politics for 50 years. And the Philippines, it's named after King Philip of Spain. They finally get their independence, but not really. So, Philippines, Emilio Aguinaldo, still seeking independence and foreign rule, led a revolt that resulted in many deaths. Revolts against the United States of America. So, they don't have a strong opinion here. They don't like Spain. They don't like the United States. They're just swapping out who's in control here. So the U.S. takes this paternalistic idea that the Philippines wasn't ready for self-rule and that they would get there someday. And really, they're seeing the potential in the island's location and the resources. So in 1901, he was captured and the fighting ended. The U.S. is going to get bogged down fighting its surge in the Philippines much more than actually fighting Spain. All right, other things they're doing. China's opened up door policy. The U.S. involvement starts in the 1830s. The Chinese empire is in decline. Foreign powers in China were lured in by the huge Chinese market, as well as missionary zeal, people wanting to convert people to Christianity. So Europeans start doing spheres of influence in which they have these unfair treaties with China to get access to certain markets. So by the late 19th century, Japan and Western European powers had carved much of China into separate spheres of influence, and within each sphere, a nation held economic dominance. In 1899, the British won a joint U.S.-British declaration. American manufacturers feared Chinese markets would be monopolized by Europeans, while American missionaries had a number of groups in China. McKinley refuses this. So we see the United States has established refueling stations in Hawaii and the Philippines. The next step was to establish trade with China. Secretary of State John Hay wrote a policy known as the Open Door Policy. Created around 1900, it allowed multiple imperial powers access to China, with none of them in control of the country. The Chinese had a secret society known as the Boxers, who launched a rebellion against the foreigners occupying China. It was called that because they basically thought that they could use martial arts to win, and that if they did it properly, they would make them immune to bullets. They were not immune to bullets. Now, none of them can be boxers. It's the fighting. So, the Boxers, they massacred Christian missionaries and other Westerners living in various parts of China. Future President Herbert Hoover and his wife, who could speak Mandarin, they had a mining operation. They have to hide during this. So they received a group of Western diplomats and their families. The Boxer Rebellion was put down after 2 days by combined forces of the imperial powers. It's the United States, it's a bunch of European powers, and Japan. So when we look at the American imperialism and getting involved in this, right, Roosevelt has the Roosevelt Corollary. The United States had the right to intervene in the affairs of Latin American nations with its political turmoil. So he does a blockade of Venezuela. So a blockade of Venezuela is when Germany and Britain imposed a naval blockade of Venezuela for Venezuela's failure to repay their loans. Roosevelt threatened a military action in order to lift the blockade. The European naval blockade of Dominican Republic. For similar reasons, Roosevelt pressured the Dominican government into letting the United States take control of the country's finances to stop this. Cuba, when there's the political unrest in Cuba threatened American economic interest, Roosevelt sent the Marines in who occupied the island from 1906 to 1909. And they have Panama. Roosevelt sent the American warships to support the Panamanians' uprising against Colombia. The United States then signed a treaty with the new Panamanian government, which purchased the 10-mile-wide strip of land that would be used for the Panama Canal. This deal would go until 1999. William Howard Taft had dollar diplomacy. He believed in extending American influence through business deals rather than by force. So in China, he tried to maintain the open door policy by encouraging American companies to join with European firms to build a major railroad in the country. And then for Nicaragua, Taft sent the Marines in Nicaragua to suppress a revolution which threatened to overthrow a pro-American government. And some of these are just ripe hypocrisies. Sometimes there is a democratically elected leader who is anti-United States, and we say, we're a beacon of freedom, we're for democracy, we overthrow them. Woodrow Wilson believed the spread of American influence would bring freedom, democracy, and peace in the globe. So Wilson disliked the dictatorial policies of the president of Mexico, Huerta. So he took advantage of the opportunity to seize the Mexican port of Veracruz. Huerta surrendered the leadership of the country to a guy called Carranza. And then Wilson, that was more pro-US, but Wilson also had skirmishes with Carranza and a bandit called Pancho Villa. In Haiti, Wilson sent the Marines to occupy the Haiti after a mob of Haitians overthrew a dictatorial government. And then Dominican Republic. Wilson helped create a democratic government in the Dominican Republic by sponsoring elections. When the government threatened to default on its foreign debts, Wilson sent troops to occupy the country, and they remained there until 1924. So you can see the big old irony here when it comes to this. All right, next time we'll be talking about World War I.